afternoon and welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press star 1 on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now, I would like to turn the call over to your speaker, to Elizabeth Martenko. You may begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Action Plan Development and Tracking, sponsored by the Children's Bureau's Division of State Systems. I'm Elizabeth Martenko, your host for today's webinar. Today's webinar is the first in DSS's series of monthly webinars for fiscal year 2014. These webinars are intended not just for child welfare IT systems managers, but also for all the staff involved in getting and keeping child welfare IT systems up and running. We encourage participation from both newer and more experienced staff, recognizing that even the most experienced among us have something new to learn or may need a refresher on the basics. Some of you may have participated in our Back to Basics series that ran from April to September 2013. We look forward to continuing our discussions in 2014. All of our past webinars are recorded and are available online as reference materials for you and your staff. Our next webinar after today will be in December. Be watching the SACWIS Managers listserv for information about that webinar. For today, attendees are encouraged to participate in our webinar with questions and comments. All of our participant lines are muted now, but we will open them at the end of the presentation for questions and discussion. You can also submit questions through the GoToWebinar chat feature, though we also will save those until the formal presentation is completed. We are fortunate today to have staff from the Division of State Systems presenting this webinar today. At this time, I'd like to introduce our federal presenters from the Division of State Systems, Pete Howe and Diane Carroll. Our third presenter today is Joe Castro with ICF International, and he is a consultant to the Children's Bureau Division of State Systems. Before we begin, we'd like to learn a little bit more about our audience today, so I'm going to put up a few polls and gather some information about you. For those of you who have participated in the past, you'll recognize our first question, which is that we would like to ask who is attending today's webinar. And I'll just give you all a few minutes to go ahead and cast your votes. And with about 80% of our audience having voted, we have our results in. And I'll just leave those posted for a moment for you all to look at. For our second poll, we'd like to know if you or your state have gone through a full 5-day SACWIS assessment review. If you could select the best answer from those that are showing. And again, with about 70% having voted, 57%, my state has gone through a SACWIS review and I participated. 19%, my state has gone through a review but I did not participate. 24%, my state has not gone through a SACWIS assessment review. I'll go ahead and post those so you all can have a look for just a minute. This is excellent. It looks like quite a few of you have some SACWIS review experience. For our third poll, if your state has not had a full SACWIS assessment review, do you anticipate having one within the next 2 years? And it looks like over half of you had one and had participated in it, so we'll see if the rest of you have something to tell us here. And it looks like 65% my state has already had a full SACWIS assessment review, and the remaining 35% my state anticipates having a review in the next 2 years. And our final poll for today, what is your state's status on action plans? My state is developing an action plan, and we have an open SARR. My state has an approved action plan, and ACF approved closed the SARR. My state has completed its action plan. Okay, and it looks like 60% my state is developing an action plan, and we have an open SARR. 27% my state has an approved action plan, and ACF approved/closed the SARR. 13% my state has completed its action plan. Thank you all for participating in today's polls. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our speaker for the day, Joe Castro.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, could you show the next slide, Elizabeth, please? Thank you. The purpose of today's presentation really is to build upon the guidance that we initially set forth in the SACWIS Technical Bulletin number 1, Action Plan, Guidance and Examples, that was issued in December of 2005. Since that time, based upon the action plans that have been submitted to DSS, we believe that there may be some benefit to doing some additional guidance, and that's hopefully what we plan to accomplish today. Okay. Next slide. The goal of this presentation is to do a number of things. One is to provide some direction on how to construct an action plan. We want to go over some of the pitfalls that we've seen some states experience in developing their action plans. We also want to identify some of the benefits of the action plan and the process of creating an action plan. And then at the end, we'll talk about how we track the process for action plans. Although an action plan provides an overall approach to compliance with the SACWIS requirement, it should never be viewed as simply a means of getting federal approval of closing the SARR. Unfortunately, we've seen some action plans that appear to be that way. It really is simply kind of like, we're going to just get this done. And we understand that there are competing priorities for states, and it's difficult. But it should never just be simply an approach to get approval and be done with it. And it should be thought of as a corrective action plan. Something in terms of being able to document how you're going to, the work that you're going to do as a project, the work that's going to be done to get that project in compliance with the federal SACWIS requirements. Elizabeth? An action plan is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for a state to really look at how their application meets a requirement or meets a set of requirements, both windows-wise and process. And that it's an opportunity to look at that process and those screens and improve the experience for the user, which ultimately, at the end, is a benefit to our client. And really, that's the goal here. I mean, that's the whole purpose of all this. So, really, is if you can take a step back, and again, understand that you have competing priorities, look at what opportunity this presents to you. It's a great approach to it. Elizabeth? And I'm going to give an example here. Nebraska had to come up with an action plan to become compliant with requirement 63, which involved tracking trust funds accounts. They simply could have taken an approach of building a few screens to do that. But what they decided to do as a project was really look at and consult with office workers, supervisors, program staff, fiscal staff, and look at what made sense in terms of the functionality, what they wanted to see, and what would meet their needs. Out of that analysis, what they found was there was a number of different problems. For one, caseworkers could not see if there was a trust account for a child, and they had to contact the fiscal staff to find out. Then what they found out was that most often that required a second contact by the caseworker to request funds. And then, for a number of different reasons, those requests for funds were often overlooked by the fiscal staff. Because of this, the Nebraska SACWIS team saw an opportunity to automate the process and, again, ultimately help the child. By taking this approach of taking a step back and really looking at the opportunity to improve the functionality and make it a better experience for their users and their clients, some functionality was created. They created the process for fiscal staff to maintain the trust account. Caseworkers could see the trust accounts. They had read access. They could automated request for expense funds, track the progress of those requests, and it just became, including the alerts and creation and the issuance. They also had some other additional benefits. They were able to create direct deposits of SSA, SSI, and 4D funds, family donations. Elizabeth? They expanded the interface between 4D and 4E to transfer excess child support funds from 4D to 4E. They automated the reconciliation of the SACWIS online accounts with bank accounts, and they created reports which eliminated spreadsheets for fiscal staff and workers. And how many times have we heard ancillary systems, and how many times have you gone out to states and seen people using Excel spreadsheets, Access database to track their work? So they were able to accomplish a number of things, correct a number of deficiencies in their application in this process. Next slide, Elizabeth. I'm going to switch over to some of the pitfalls that we've seen in submissions to us of action plans. And the first one really that stands out is the lack of analysis. Too often we have seen the solution just being a restatement of our findings. We know what our finding is, and we've identified an issue, but that doesn't really speak to what's causing the issue or what the root cause of that problem is. So analysis really is critical here. It really drives everything else in the action. The other pitfall that we've seen is inadequate resources. Often, we've seen some states that the plan is assigned to a worker who has more bandwidth, that they believe they can be doing it, and there's no input from program staff or technical input, and it really relies on one or two people to develop the plan. Elizabeth? That kind of leads into the next pitfall, which is inadequate expertise. The staff assigned don't understand what action plans are. They don't understand the SACWIS requirements. They may not be unfamiliar with the system functionality or even the business practice. So it becomes really difficult for them to come up with a really sound action plan to address the needs. The other pitfall is that the plan stands by itself. It's not incorporated into the overall project plan. And it's just on the side and really difficult to attend to and maintain because it's not part of that whole process or plan for the maintenance of your application. And the last thing that we've seen is really a lack of a schedule. There's an implementation date, but there's no milestones or dates associated to milestones or tasks so that the progress towards completion can be tracked. And that's critical for us. We need to know how you're progressing. And if there's slippage, to be able to see where it is and as soon as it happens. Simply having an implementation date doesn't give us that ability and doesn't give the project that ability either. Elizabeth? The consequences, which I've mentioned some already, of those pitfalls is, and first and foremost, it fails to move the project towards SACWIS compliance. It fails to meet the business needs and user needs. Again, you have something being implemented that doesn't address the issue, and it just doesn't meet anyone. And most often what's going to happen with that is DSS, the Division of State Systems, is going to ask the project to retry drafting the plan, which means that you've lost time and resources in your initial effort. Based upon the plans that we've received and some of these pitfalls, we believe the best practice is to assemble a team consisting of users, program staff, technical staff to analyze the problem and come up with a solution. Much like you have in the JAD session where you have both program people, users, and technical people, this is what the approach that you want to take so that you don't go down a path that you cannot do, either program-wise or technical-wise. And think of it as similar in the approach that you would take to a change request, the analysis, the identification of what needs to be done, who's going to be doing it, and the level of effort to get it done. When you compose the action plan, you need to include and be very descriptive of all the proposed changes, all the steps that need to address the issue, and including all those things that are part of the change. Not only screen changes, but code value changes, data model changes, and report changes. Most often these changes don't just hit one thing. Next slide, please. When you get, as part of this preparation, what you want to do is make sure that you review the action plan and make sure that it's complete, that it has all the things, and we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about the content, and that it's written in a manner that's clear and apparent to the reader what the solution is, who's going to be doing what and when. And don't assume that someone understands. It's easy for all of us. We all do this. We fall into the trap of we're so familiar with our systems that we tend to forget that people looking at it may not know all the little things about it. So you need to really be attentive to that kind of detail. Next slide. Okay, the content, the how, analysis. And again, analysis is critical to all of this. And I have a couple of bullet points here about how critical it is in terms of being able to identify the solution. And you cannot identify the solution unless you really truly analyze the issue and know what the root causes are. Next slide. Okay. The solution should be able to clearly state what the issue is, what is the cause of it, and answer these questions. What is happening? What is the effect of this? Can it be fixed? How will the solution satisfy the SACWIS requirement? And lastly, and really very important, how does it support the user's business needs in practice? We should be able to, in our review of the action plan, be able to see that you've answered all those questions. Next slide. And again, as part of answering those questions, you need to be very descriptive. Again, and going back to the little point that I mentioned earlier about all the changes included, not only just screen changes, but database changes, reports changes, all of that. It's very critical. Next slide. And this is an important part. The solution doesn't necessarily always involve a change to functionality. It can be simply additional training. We have seen action plans where an issue may be, let's say, intake, where the issue is that people are not entering the intake in real time. They're writing down stuff and then re-entering it into the system. And we've seen the states in their analysis realize that the functionality is there, but people were unaware of it and needed to be retrained. They had not done a thorough job of training that they needed to do. It may also involve some more technical assistance, being able to put out more how-to guides or those kind of supporting documentation to help people get through things and do it. So it isn't simply always a system change or function change. And again, you may also, when you have those function changes, want to include whatever additional training or technical support you're going to do. Because if you're making major changes, you're going to need to be doing some training and some support. Next slide. The why, the rationale. This is where we have the Division of State Systems will get an understanding that you really have approached this and have done a thorough job of analyzing the issue. It should describe what the process was for identifying the solution. It could be, as we talked about, a focus group of intake workers, policy staff, and programs to analyze a navigation issue with intake. It really, for us, demonstrates and illustrates that the project did a thorough analysis of the issue and truly understands what they're trying to do and what they're trying to fix. The why, the rationale should answer the following questions. Why was it selected? What makes it the best option in meeting the SACWIS requirement? And again, very important, how does it support the case practice model in the user's needs? It really should stand out that this was our best option, or your best option. And then the schedule, the what, when, and who. The schedule really makes the proposed solution real and measurable. It gives it, it defines it. When's it going to happen, and how is it going to happen? It sets a time frame for the implementation. And it should, and again, I've said this a couple of different times, it should be incorporated in your overall project plan. You cannot, I think it'd be really hard to realistically identify resources and time frames for the solution if you're not incorporating it, if it's not part of your project plan. And again, if it stands up by itself, it's much harder to get accomplished. Next slide. The schedule should include the tasks and milestones, things like requirement gathering, design documentation, development phase, testing, and if you can, even breaking testing down to something like system testing and user acceptance testing, and then any training that might be implemented after. It should include due dates for each of those tasks and milestones, again, so that we can track, you can track your progress towards completion, and we can see if there's any slippage. It should identify who's doing the work, whether it's state personnel, contractors, or a combination of the two, and whether it's technical or business staff that are working on it. It should also include the purchase of servers, software, those kind of things, because they can affect the schedule, and we need to see where they're at. In addition to the action plan, you can provide us with supporting documentation, change requests that have been done, design documentation, and of course the updated project plan that includes the action plan itself. We also, with any plan, there's always potential risk. You should identify those risks and your mitigation plan for it. And then if there's any potential qualifiers or conditions that may delay or derail the implementation of the plan. If you're waiting for funding to be approved by the legislature or something along those lines, it's critical to include that too, so we have a realistic picture. The benefits. And there are a number of benefits to the action plan and the action plan process as we've outlined. First of all, we believe that you get users buy-in to the project because they're part of the process of identifying a solution as opposed to having something imposed upon them. And we all know that it's better if you're part of something, you take ownership of it as opposed to having someone say, this is what you need to do. It creates also an understanding for both the system users and for your federal partners about what's possible for the project to do. There may be constraints upon you, either technical, resource, or funding that we or the users are unaware of, that helps us both understand why you chose a certain path and why you can't do other options. Slide. It saves money, time, and energy. Poorly developed plan has a higher risk of failure, which means you're going to have to do it again, a waste of time and resources, and even developing the plan. If you aren't able to get it approved the first time, it means doing it over again. And again, a waste of time and resources. It promotes state and federal partnership because we're able to see that you really have made a focused and dedicated effort to improving your system and addressing the needs. And it assures us, the Division of State Systems, that you have a real understanding of what needs to be done to help your workers and ultimately, again, help your clients. Slide. It provides a method of tracking progress towards SACWIS compliance. I know for some states, I know Nebraska for one was one that said they used it, how close they were getting to SACWIS compliance. It helped them in that process. It gives you an idea of where you stand at any moment. Because we've talked about the project plan, we've talked about planning, approach and all, it allows for an accurate and realistic project management, moving the project forward. And again, because you're using a team approach and a number of people are involved, it facilitates coordination between all those different teams that you have to work with, both program, policy, and And lastly, again, one of the most important parts of the benefits of all of this is that it gives you that opportunity to make your system better for its users and ultimately better for service provided to your clients. And really, that's what this is all about. And I stress that a lot. I think it's very important to keep in mind. Again, given all the competing priorities that you have. Next slide. The plan review. DSS will assess sorry about that. We'll review an action plan to make sure that it's the narrative, the project plan, and supporting documentation are complete, that it conforms with the SACWIS requirements, and that it will be implemented in a timely manner. We can't have action plans that are 7, 8 years out. We really need to know that you're focused and committed to this. Next slide. We will review proposed action plans through an open SARR. And in some states, what we've actually done is had them submit drafts of action plans, which we've commented on, and give it back to them with some guidance so that we can work through it before they formally submit it. DSS will then review and monitor approved action plans through the advanced planning document process. APD updates and operational APDs must have a section in there that comments on the status of the approved action plan so that we can track your progress. These are some references, resources that we used in developing this webinar. The first one is obviously the technical bulletin that we issued. And you should go back if you have the opportunity to look at it. It's very helpful. And then there's some other resources and websites that in terms of writing an action plan or corrective action plan, that may be of service. I apologize. I think that was probably a little quick going through, but that's our presentation for now. Just Elizabeth, questions?
Sure. Tanya actually is our operator. I'm going to turn it over to her if you could give instructions to folks about how they can line up on the phone to ask questions.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please press star, then 1. To withdraw your question, press star, then 2. Once again, to ask a question on the phone line, please press star, then 1. One moment, please, for the first question.
I'm going to put one to the group, and Joe, it doesn't have to be you that answers. I know that we've made you talk for a long time at one clip. I think the Nebraska example was really a wonderful one, and I'm wondering if there's one that you or Pete or Diane, another one that maybe you could share, what a finding would be, and then you talked about how states need to not restate the finding, but really indicate that there's been some analysis behind it. So I'm wondering if there's another example that you could share. You don't necessarily need to name the state, where you all made a finding, and then what you saw in the action plan that indicated to you that the state had really done that kind of thorough analysis that they need to do when you looked at their action plan.
Elizabeth, this is Pete. I'll take that.
Okay.
I'll take that question.
I knew I didn't stump you guys.
No, a lot of times what we'll see, for an example, we always say that the SACWIS system should freeze an intake upon completion of that intake. And a lot of times we'll see that that intake is frozen at an inappropriate time within a state according to the state's policy on freezing an intake. So what we like to see in the action plan is how the state has gone about addressing when that intake will be frozen, and how they determined that is the best time to freeze an intake. Okay. And so that, that's just one of the examples. We could probably go on for the rest of the call. But
Actually, Elizabeth, I recently looked at one that initially the action plan submitted by the state restated it was an intake, and that intake workers were not entering information directly into the application. And that's all they said in their first action plan. Then when they redid it and showed the analysis, what they realized in their analysis was that a couple of things. One was that the navigation through the intake screens was rigid. It had to follow a certain pattern, and that often the caller wasn't following that pattern. So workers couldn't put in the information following the screens as the caller was giving it to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they ended up writing it all down on paper to key in later. Mm-hmm. The other part that they realized in their analysis was that there were several fields that were no longer relevant and didn't need to be on the screen, and the information didn't need to be captured, and just were a burden to the intake worker in terms of getting through the screen to get to the other information. So in their analysis, they realized they needed to eliminate some screens, change the navigation to allow more flexibility, to be able to put information so that the caller could give them the information in the way that they felt. And that's an example, I think, of when a state kind of looks at the analysis and looks at the issue and identifies, okay, what do we need to change to meet that requirement, as opposed to just restating the finding.
Sure. I think it really speaks to what you talked about, too, about that really being then an opportunity for the state to make changes to the system so it really supported the needs of the users much better.
And I'll use another example. When I was working for Massachusetts, the process was not only to look at what we need to do to address the requirement, but we used Remedy at that point to track all of our bugs, and we would call up a Remedy report for all the issues that had been identified for a certain process, and we would look at them and meet as a team and go through them, eliminate the ones that were in conflict with each other, and look at the ones that made sense to improve the user's experience, along with improving the requirements. And Tommy will probably kill me for doing this, but Tommy Abraham was the one who kept saying to me, take it, let's fix it once, and let's be done with it. I'm sure all of our listeners know that the more often you touch screens or touch a process, the more often the greater probability of breaking something occurs. So, and in terms of efficiency and use of resources and time, you want to go in and touch something once, not multiple times. So again, that was a process that we used to address something and take the opportunity to improve something.
I have I actually have one question through the chat box, but it has multiple parts. How quickly is the SARR due after the review?
I'm sorry, Elizabeth, speak. Could you restate that question, please?
Sure. What the person has asked is, how quickly is the SARR due after the review?
I think, Peter, what we're being asked is, how soon can they expect our report after we've been out to a state?
Okay, that timeline will vary depending, of course, on what we find out in the state. Generally, you can expect to receive the report from our SACWIS assessment no later than 6 months after we've been out there.
And after an action plan is approved, does ACF come back on site to complete continued reviews to monitor the completion of the action steps?
According to our APD regulations, we have the authority to come and look at a system at any time. And even after we have closed your system, we would expect the state to be maintaining that system as a SACWIS compliant system, because you are receiving a favorable cost allocation for the operation of that system. And so, yes, we do reserve the right, even after we've closed you out, to come out and look at your system again. And which means, it's a good question, because that also means that if we find that the state has failed to maintain the system as a SACWIS compliant system, we can open that up again, and we can have additional findings, which would mean that you would have additional action plans to bring it back into conformance.
And to the person who asked, if that didn't answer it, feel free to push *1 to ask on the phone or type back in the chat box. Tanya, do we have any callers lined up to ask questions on the phone?
At this time, we have no questions on the phone line. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *, then 1.
Okay. I do have another online question. How soon is the corrective action due after the ACF review document is sent to the state?
You want me to take that one again? We work with the state. We will work with the state. There is no set timeline to say that you have to have something back to us in X amount of time. We generally work with the state to make sure that we get good action plans, and it's just a matter of timing and how much we're working with you, and we always give you plenty of time to do it. It's not something, let me put it this way, it's not something that you're going to be able to do in a week or a month or even 2 months. A lot of times we see states that may take them up to 6 months to get the action plans done. And so the time will vary. There is no set time. Although I won't let them go out for 2 or 3 years and not have approvable action plans.
So when Joe mentioned ones that go 6 to 7 years, that was hypothetical. That's not really anything you really want to see.
That's not acceptable. No.
Okay.
I think that was my point.
But this is Diane. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think the point you also were trying to make earlier, Joe, is that even if you have your action plan in within like 3 or 4 months, if your implementation date is 8 years out,
Right.
that could be a problem.
Yes.
I think he was talking about something quite a little different.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry about that.
I think that there's 2 parts. Pete's correct about, we want to see something within a certain reasonable amount of time in terms and we do expect that it will take some time to develop the action plan. I mean, we're asking you to do a thorough analysis. You need to do that. Will take some time. My point about the 7 or 8 years was that an action plan that projects implementation out 7 or 8 years from now would not be acceptable. That it has to be a reasonable time. And again, that's critical because again, things can change in this environment, and you need to get the system up and running.
And since we're on the references and resources page, I'm wondering, Pete, you had said that CV staff are certainly available to work with states, and I'm wondering, what other supports and resources are available to states as they're developing their action plans, if they're struggling maybe to do some of the analysis, or is that something that they can call for help with? What kinds of things are you all available to help them do as they're working on this?
Well, we have technical bulletins out there on our website that they can always go out and look at. And there is actually AP action plan guide out there as well, and that they can go out and look at that. And just, then they can always be in contact with us.
Yeah. Tanya, do we have other questions on the line?
At this time, we have no questions on the phone line.
So I'll turn it back to our presenters. I didn't know if there was other information you wanted to share, any other comments or thoughts?
I would like to reinforce that we have found really helpful the process of having states submit draft action plans to us for us to review and discuss with them before they formally submit them. We find that process works much better in terms of getting to a plan that can be approved and satisfy the requirements, and that we're available to do that.
Wonderful. Diane and Pete, any closing comments or thoughts from you all?
I would like to say thank you for people who have joined our webinar today and our participation. Your participation is greatly appreciated. And I'd also like to say, keep in touch with your federal analyst, especially if you were in the middle of doing action plans, because we would be available to help any way we can.
Diane, any last words? That didn't come out right.
Well, no. No, I mean, I've been a SACWIS manager for 10 years. I've lived on the other side of this, too. So I encourage you to work with your analyst. That was my example that we gave because I'm from Nebraska. And, the fact that we took the time to talk to our users, I can't stress that enough, that we turned it into something that truly helped. It could have been a very simple functionality just to get the requirement done. It ended up being something that truly helped both the fiscal and case management staff. So take your time and see what you can do with it to really make a difference with your system if you get the time to do it.
All right. Tanya, one last check to see if anyone's online.
At this time, we have no further questions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I would just like to remind our audience that today's presentation has been recorded, and the recording, along with the PowerPoint slides, will be made available on the Children's Bureau website. It generally takes us about 10 days to post those materials because we need to make them 508 compliant, so that takes us a little bit of time. Our next webinar will be the start of a series that we're going to do on procurement and project management. So keep an eye on the SACWIS Managers listserv for more information about that. And the first webinar in that series will be in December. So I would also like to thank our audience for joining us, especially on a Friday afternoon. And I look forward to talking to all of you again in December. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thank you for joining today's conference. You may